In January 1894, mine owners in Cripple Creek, Colorado, increased the workday from 8 to 9 and to 10 hours without an increase in pay. Those that wanted to stay at 8 hours would have to take a 50-cent pay decrease per day, a significant amount in that time. The miners of the Free Coinage Union No. 19, itself a part of the Western Federation of Miners, disagreed with these new conditions. The workers went on strike, setting up picket lines and closing down mines. Unlike other such strikes in the West, the mine owners were not able to get military or police aid in order to shut down the strike, and when those mine owners organized a private army, they are met with bullets and dynamite. Eventually, with the aid of the populist governor of Colorado, David White, the union and owners reached an agreement for an 8-hour day with $3 daily wage. This is one of the early stories of American workers fighting and succeeding in securing some key rights from owners and bosses. Stories like these echo throughout the history of American labor from the industrial period to the modern day. In this presentation, we go over the history of American workers and labor rights and how the American people have and continue to combat and face inequality in work. Welcome back. This presentation, as you can see, is about workers' rights and inequalities. To give you a quick table of contents of what will be covered, we'll start with an introduction. We'll go over the history of the labor movement in America. We'll look at some examples of contemporary labor action, and then we'll move on to a final section of theory and application. We'll move on to the next slide here. Before we begin, we'll launch this quick video on the labor movement.
To most of us, Labor Day means time off from work, maybe a barbecue to mark the official end of summer. But how much do you know about what inspired its creation? The labor movement. The labor movement started around the Industrial Revolution, a time in the late 19th century when America exploded in size and wealth. Advances in technology created manufacturing jobs, and people moved to cities to work in factories. But it wasn't the workers getting rich. It was their bosses who raked in big profits by paying low wages for long hours. Fed up with big business, industrial workers created unions to fight for better conditions. Unions are the backbone of the labor movement. But what exactly did they accomplish? Well, for one, you can thank the labor movement for your work-free weekend. In the late 1800s, the average American worked as much as 100 hours a week. Unions held strikes to demand shorter work weeks and an 8-hour workday to make time for family and relaxation. The most famous strike, the Haymarket Riots, happened in Chicago on May 1st, 1886, with thousands of people taking to the streets, and their voices only grew louder from there. The labor movement also protested child labor. Remember those black and white photos of children with dirty, sad faces wearing overalls and beanie caps? Those kids weren't playing outside, but they were working in factories. In 1881, unions demanded that businesses stop hiring kids under 14, and slowly but surely, measures against child labor caught on around the country. Eventually, all those protests got results. In 1938, Congress passed a law called the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set the 40-hour work week, regulated child labor, and set standards for minimum wage and overtime pay. In the 1930s and 1940s, workers were also able to negotiate health benefit plans from their employers. Though union membership is on a decline today, it's undeniable that the labor movement forever changed the way Americans live, work, and even relax.
To give you a quick look at the timeline of what will be covered in terms of the labor movement history, we're going to start off all the way in 1794 with the Federal Society of Journeymen and Cordwainers, and we'll end the history section with the Red Scare and Ronald Reagan in 1980 before moving on to contemporary examples. Next. Before we begin in earnest, just a quick quote from FDR, one of the probably the most prominent labor presidents in American history. No country, however rich, can afford the waste of its human resources. Demoralization caused by vast unemployment is our greatest extravagance. Morally, it is the greatest menace to our social order. As you can see, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was obviously the proponent of the New Deal during the Great Depression. He will be covered later. We'll move on to history of earnest, the evolution of the labor movement. Just a quick overview of from the 18th century all the way to the modern day. We'll start off with our first event. As long as there has been labor, there have been labor disputes. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the main indentured servants and fishermen's mutiny, etc. The reason I point this out is to show the fact that the rights of workers have a long history far beyond what I will cover today. This presentation will focus on workers' rights in America specifically, from the industrial period to today. At that time period is where modern ideas of work and workers' rights emerged from. We'll begin with a history of labor rights in America, as I said, then conclude with a discussion of how labor rights factor into worker rights in terms of inequality. After industrialization, what Americans did for work changed. How they thought about work changed. Workers now worked long hours in dark and often dangerous factories with little compensation for that work, with most of the profit going to the boss or owner of a factory or business. Out of this tension arose the first unions and modern idea of labor movements. In 1794, the Federal Society of Journeymen Cordwainers Shoemakers was formed as the first American union to combat exploitation of workers by owners. This event followed the first strike in 1768, which was held by the New York tailors protesting a wage decrease. These events, right before the 19th century, started modern labor relations and conflict moving into the new working world. Moving into the 19th century proper, unions popped up everywhere in all type. Trade unions fought for safer conditions, better pay, and shorter work days. In 1827, an anonymous pamphlet was spread across to workers of various trades, advocating for them to join together across job lines to advocate for reduced workday down to 10 hours, suffrage, and other labor considerations. Those workers formed the Mechanics' Union of Trade Associations in Philadelphia. This marked the start of centralized union organizations of many different trades within a city, taking it a step farther. In 1852, the International Typographical Union was formed, which was a nationwide union and even had some members in Canada. The ITU also was a driving force behind the establishment of the 40-hour work week during the Great Depression. Beginning in the mid to late 1800s, equal rights and labor reform groups like the National Labor Party and the Knights of Labor emerged. These groups focused more on Commonwealth and appealing to all producers rather than just wage workers. Their goal was to improve labor wholesale, to make better labor practices and policies for the future, in contrast to unions at the time that sought to address workers' immediate needs. It's important to remember that these groups were not separate, but simply two arms of the body of workers' rights. If we move on to the next slide. In 1886, trade unions joined together to form the American Federation of Labor, a group focused less on labor reform as the perceived need for it waned with the failure of organizations like the Knights of Labor. The AFL was founded and influenced by Marxist and socialist thought and sought to create strong unionism, and with that a strong working class or proletariat. The AFL continues on today as the AFL-CIO, having combined with the Congress of Industrial Organizations in 1955. Back in the 1800s, although the AFL claimed to represent all workers, it was made up of unions representing the skilled trades. This created a tension between ideology and reality. Furthermore, because skilled and unskilled labor tended to be divided by racial and gender lines, the AFL was mainly a white man's organization. The next big event in the labor movement was the Great Depression and the New Deal. Although they tended to stay at the center, unions and labor organizations moved in support of the left. The New Deal period helped to elevate a lot of pressures on the working peoples during the Depression and established the start of a lot of contemporary labor laws like 40-hour work weeks, a minimum wage, and ended oppressive child labor. The New Deal coalition, which heavily featured labor unions, helped establish a union left. Post-World War II, unions used tactics and rights to more than triple weekly earnings in fields such as manufacturing and also precautions for illness and old age. This period of time was the start of benefits as we know them today. However, the labor movement still did not reach a majority of Americans, particularly those in low-wage jobs. Although there were more women and people of color in the workplace following World War II and the Civil Rights Movement, if we move on to the next slide, leadership and organization of labor organizations tended to be closed to them. Even with that said, labor unions did play a key part in the Civil Rights Movement, and some more progressive leaders within those unions welcomed the change to society at large and the change within their organizations. Entering the 1970s, union power started to enter its twilight, cemented by Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 and its anti-union government, as well as the Red Scare and McCarthyism. Even moving into today, unions and the labor movement at large have not recovered to their previous strength. I thought that it would be pertinent to look at some of the labor movement in the contemporary period. Next slide. Actors and writers strike of the 2023. The actors and writers of Hollywood went on strike. Big issue for them was the issue of residuals and pay. Specifically, writers as well moved to have restrictions against AI replacing their jobs, as that was a key concern of that strike. Actors also had concerns about AI, such as being able to sell your face, basically. I remember that was a big thing. Eventually, they did reach a deal with the studios and the studios and the executive branch of that in order to secure some of those rights, although there was some concessions. I think a big thing for writers that they didn't necessarily get a ton of, or as much as they wanted, was things like mandatory staffing, especially as we move into the streaming period. There was an issue of smaller and smaller writers' rooms, which was kind of killing the profession. And there was huge concerns about duration of employment, specifically because streaming services make shorter shows. There was an issue of not having long periods of employment for writers. And much the same with actors that are not, the A-list. Moving on to the second contemporary example I want to look at is the auto worker strike in 2023. This was the United States auto workers against Ford Motor Company, General Motors, and Stellantis. This was for a few different reasons. Because of stagnant wages was a big concern. That they also wanted to end tiered employment, which is where new employees would come on as temporary workers and get paid much less. They also wanted restoration of overtime and retirement benefits, which were removed in the recession of 2007-2008. And they did also advocate for a 4-day week way. Eventually, they did reach a tentative deal with those three companies, and their demands were met. Specifically, they did get the retirement and overtime. I think some things are still up in the air because it is still so recent, so I don't know where they stand with the 4-day week way, but here's hoping. Wouldn't that be nice? And moving on to our final contemporary example, less positive, Starbucks Corp versus McKinney. In 2022, Starbucks fired 7 workers who were trying to unionize in one of their stores. They claimed that this firing was because these workers had brought in a camera crew after hours, which had broken their policy. The Starbucks workers themselves said that this policy was being wagered against employees that were trying to unionize. There was an injunction filed, but it eventually went all the way up to the Supreme Court, who eventually ended up siding with Starbucks Corp and enforcing a precedent from 2008 in terms of how these deliberations are made. So they were unable to reinstate their jobs, unfortunately. Yeah, that's some contemporary examples. I think it's important to look at where labor movement is now. You can see that it's it is up and down. It's not quite as strong as it was probably during the golden era of union, which was the mid 20th century, probably mid 20th century to early late 20th century was kind of the golden era. Obviously, when the 70s arrived is when union power started to decrease, and we see a lot of the explosion of corporate powers, especially as well with the fall of the Soviet Union, as well as other communist states. You see a rise in kind of capitalist extravagance during that period. Well, that's all for the contemporary examples. Let's move on to the application of some theory. The labor movement is a struggle against the inequality that appears in capitalist systems. We see the application of Marxist thought in the organization and ideology of unions, for example, to combat owners and support the working class. Now, inequality is increasing. This inequality spills over to all facets of society at large. Because of the decrease of union power, we are seeing this inequality and spillover in higher and higher levels. We can see this connection between union power and inequality because inequality increased starting in the 1970s, the same time union power decreased. Now, to conclude, the history of the labor movement can be seen as the fight against inequality and for equity. Ideas of labor and workers' rights are very tied to this idea of human rights, and with the decrease of union power, we've seen an increase of inequality. And while there is a struggle for workers' rights now, cases like the auto workers' strike and the SAG-AFTRA strikes show that there is hope for the future.